Welcome to Part 2. Your nervous system learned responsibility. In the previous episode, we explored emotional responsibility. The responsible daughter, the helper, the fixer, the woman who quietly carries more than her share. And perhaps, for the first time, you began to recognize that responsibility may have become more than a behavior, more than a personality trait, more than simply being caring. You may have started to see responsibility as a survival role, a role that developed over years of adaptation, a role that slowly became identity, and for many daughters, that recognition brings relief. Because finally, there is an explanation. Finally, there is language. Finally, there is a reason why carrying everyone else has always felt so natural. But recognition often creates a new question. A question many women don't expect. If I understand the pattern, why do I still feel it? Why do I still feel guilty when someone is upset? Why do I still feel uncomfortable when I say no? Why do I still feel responsible when I know the responsibility isn't mine? Why do I still feel compelled to step in, help, fix, rescue, explain, or manage? Because understanding a pattern and changing a pattern are not the same thing. You can understand exactly why something exists and still feel trapped by it. You can recognize a survival role and still find yourself performing it. You can understand your conditioning and still struggle to respond differently. And that is where many daughters become frustrated. Because awareness promised freedom, yet the feelings remain. The guilt remains. The anxiety remains. The discomfort remains. The responsibility remains. And the reason is surprisingly simple. Responsibility did not only become identity, responsibility became regulation. At some point, your nervous system learned something important. Helping reduces discomfort. Fixing reduces discomfort. Managing reduces discomfort. Anticipating reduces discomfort. Carrying reduces discomfort. Not permanently, not completely, but enough. Enough for the nervous system to remember. Enough for the pattern to repeat. Enough for responsibility to become associated with safety. This is why many daughters continue carrying burdens they consciously know are not theirs. Not because they are weak. Not because they lack boundaries. Not because they haven't done enough healing. But because the nervous system is operating according to a different set of rules. The nervous system is not asking, "Does this responsibility belong to me?" The nervous system is asking, "Does this behavior create safety?" And for many women, the answer became yes. Years ago. Long before they understood why. Long before they had language for it. Long before they knew words like conditioning, adaptation, trauma, emotional neglect, parentification, or survival roles. The nervous system simply learned. When I help, I feel safer. When I fix, I feel safer. When I anticipate, I feel safer. When I manage, I feel safer. When I carry, I feel safer. And eventually, that learning becomes automatic. So automatic that many women mistake it for instinct. They mistake it for personality. They mistake it for who they are. But if responsibility became associated with safety, then something important follows. Letting go of responsibility can feel unsafe, not logically, not rationally, nervously, emotionally, physically. The body reacts, the mind reacts, the emotions react. And suddenly a daughter who genuinely wants change finds herself pulled back into familiar patterns. Helping, fixing, managing, rescuing. Not because she wants to remain stuck, because the nervous system is attempting to recreate familiarity. and familiarity often feels safer than freedom. Even when familiarity is exhausting, even when familiarity creates burnout, even when familiarity prevents growth. This is why so many women understand their patterns but struggle to change them. Because information alone rarely transforms nervous system learning. Awareness is important. Recognition is important. Understanding is important. But the nervous system learns through experience. And today, we're going to explore exactly what happens when responsibility becomes a form of regulation. Why helping creates relief. Why guilt appears when you stop. Why boundaries feel uncomfortable. Why awareness often isn't enough. And why emotional responsibility can continue long after the original environment has disappeared. Because if Part 1 explored why the role formed, Part 2 explores why the body keeps performing it. And that distinction changes everything. Section 1. When helping creates relief. One of the most confusing experiences for many daughters is this: helping feels good. In fact, helping can feel so good that it becomes difficult to imagine it as part of the problem. After all, helping is considered a positive thing, helping is praised, helping is encouraged. Helping is often seen as evidence of kindness, compassion, and emotional maturity. So when someone suggests that helping may sometimes be connected to a survival pattern, many women immediately feel resistance. Because helping isn't bad. And they're right. Helping is not bad. The question is not whether helping is good or bad. The question is, what happens inside you when you don't help? Because that is often where the pattern reveals itself. Imagine someone you care about is struggling. Perhaps they are stressed. Perhaps they are upset. Perhaps they are overwhelmed. Perhaps they are disappointed. You notice it immediately. And almost instantly, something begins happening inside your body. A sense of tension. A sense of urgency. A feeling that something needs attention. A feeling that something needs resolving. Not because anyone has asked you to intervene, because your nervous system has already identified a problem. And when the nervous system identifies a problem, it naturally begins searching for a solution. For many daughters, the solution becomes helping, offering advice, providing reassurance, taking responsibility, fixing the situation, managing the atmosphere, doing something, anything, because action creates relief. The moment you step in, the tension decreases. The moment you help, the urgency softens. The moment you start fixing, your body feels calmer. And because the discomfort reduced, the nervous system records something important. Helping worked. Not necessarily because the situation improved, but because your internal discomfort improved. This distinction matters, because many daughters believe they are helping primarily for other people, but often there is another process occurring underneath. The nervous system is regulating itself. The helping behavior reduces anxiety. The helping behavior reduces uncertainty. The helping behavior reduces emotional discomfort. And every time that happens, the pattern becomes stronger. Not consciously. Automatically, the nervous system begins creating an association. Discomfort appears, helping follows. Relief arrives. The lesson is reinforced. Years later, the pattern becomes so familiar that it feels like instinct. Someone is upset. You move toward the problem. Someone is struggling. You take responsibility. Someone is disappointed. You begin searching for solutions. Not because the responsibility belongs to you, because your body has learned that helping creates relief. And relief feels good. This is one of the reasons emotional responsibility becomes so difficult to recognize, because the behavior often produces a reward. Not financial reward, not social reward, nervous system reward. The reward of reduced tension, reduced anxiety, reduced uncertainty, reduced discomfort. And once a nervous system discovers a reliable way to reduce discomfort, it tends to repeat it. Again, and again, and again, until the behavior becomes automatic. The daughter no longer pauses to ask, "Is this mine to carry?" She simply carries it. The daughter no longer asks, "Was I asked to solve this?" She simply begins solving. The daughter no longer asks, "Am I responsible for this person's emotions?" She simply feels responsible, because responsibility has become linked to regulation. This is why many women feel strangely uncomfortable when they attempt to stop helping. Logically, they know the problem isn't theirs. Logically, they understand the responsibility belongs elsewhere. Yet the discomfort remains. The urge remains. The anxiety remains. The need to step in remains. And this often creates confusion. Many daughters conclude, "Maybe I don't care enough. Maybe I'm selfish. Maybe I'm abandoning people. Maybe I'm doing something wrong." But what if the discomfort has nothing to do with morality? What if the discomfort is simply the nervous system reacting to a missing coping strategy? Because for years helping reduced discomfort, for years helping created relief, for years helping created a sense of safety. And now the nervous system is being asked to tolerate uncertainty without immediately reaching for the familiar solution. That feels uncomfortable. Not because you're failing, because you're interrupting a pattern. And whenever a long-standing pattern is interrupted, discomfort often appears first. This is why awareness alone rarely changes behavior. You can understand the pattern completely. You can recognize exactly where it came from. You can identify it while it's happening and still feel the urge to perform it. Because nervous system learning operates differently from intellectual understanding, the body remembers what reduced discomfort. The body remembers what created safety. The body remembers what worked. And for many daughters, helping worked. Not because it solved every problem, but because it reduced enough discomfort for the nervous system to keep choosing it, again and again. Which leads us to an important question. If helping creates relief, what happens when you stop? Because this is where many women encounter one of the strongest emotions associated with emotional responsibility: guilt. And understanding that guilt may change the way you see yourself entirely. Section 2. Why guilt appears when you stop. There is a moment many daughters know well. You decide not to step in. You decide not to fix. You decide not to solve. You decide not to carry. And almost immediately, something happens. Not outside of you, inside of you. Guilt. A feeling that arrives so quickly it can seem like proof that you've made the wrong decision, proof that you've let someone down, proof that you've become selfish, proof that you should go back and help. And because the feeling is so uncomfortable, many women do exactly that. They step back into the familiar role, the fixer, the helper, the responsible one. The guilt disappears. The nervous system relaxes. And once again the pattern is reinforced. But what if guilt isn't always telling you that you've done something wrong? What if guilt is sometimes telling you that you've done something different? This is where many daughters become trapped, because they treat guilt as information, instead of recognizing it as a reaction. Think about it this way. If you've spent years automatically helping whenever someone struggles, then not helping will feel unfamiliar. If you've spent years making other people comfortable, then allowing discomfort will feel unfamiliar. If you've spent years carrying emotional responsibility, then putting it down will feel unfamiliar. And unfamiliar experiences often create nervous system discomfort. The problem is that the nervous system doesn't label the feeling, it simply produces it. The mind then creates a story. The story might sound like, you should do more. You should check in. You should fix this. You should make sure they're okay. You're being selfish. You're abandoning them. But often these thoughts are not evidence. They are attempts to return to familiarity. Because helping was familiar. Carrying was familiar. Responsibility was familiar. And the nervous system tends to prefer familiar experiences, even when those experiences are exhausting. This is why guilt often appears before freedom, not after, but before. The daughter sets a boundary. Guilt appears. The daughter says no. Guilt appears. The daughter lets someone solve their own problem. Guilt appears. The daughter prioritizes herself. Guilt appears. Not because the action was wrong, because the action interrupted an old pattern, and interruptions create uncertainty. For many women, this is one of the most important realizations in the healing process. Feeling guilty does not automatically mean you are guilty. Feeling responsible does not automatically mean you are responsible. Feeling uncomfortable does not automatically mean you should go back. Because if every uncomfortable feeling becomes a reason to return to old behaviors, nothing changes. The pattern simply continues. And perhaps the most difficult part is that nobody sees this happening. Other people see a woman who struggles to say no, a woman who overextends herself, a woman who carries too much. But they don't see the internal conflict. The battle between what she knows intellectually and what her nervous system has learned emotionally. Intellectually, she knows, this isn't mine to fix. Emotionally, she feels, I need to do something. And those two experiences can exist at the same time. Which is why awareness often feels frustrating, because awareness changes what you know, but nervous system learning influences what you feel. And feelings often arrive faster than logic. This is why many daughters become discouraged. They think, I know better now. So why do I still feel guilty? The answer is because guilt is often the emotional residue of an old survival strategy. A strategy that once made sense. A strategy that once created safety. A strategy that once helped you navigate relationships, unpredictability, and emotional environments. But what once protected you may no longer be necessary, and yet the feeling remains. Not because you're failing, because your nervous system is learning a new experience. The experience of allowing people to have their own emotions. The experience of allowing discomfort to exist. The experience of not immediately stepping in. The experience of discovering that other people's emotional worlds can remain theirs. And perhaps most importantly, the experience of discovering that your worth does not decrease when you stop carrying everyone else. That is a lesson many daughters were never taught. And it is one the nervous system often needs time to believe. Because guilt is not always a sign that you've done something wrong. Sometimes it's a sign that you're doing something differently. And that distinction can change everything. Section 3. Why responsibility creates predictability. One of the reasons responsibility becomes so difficult to release is that it creates something many nervous systems crave. Predictability. Not happiness, not freedom, predictability. Because predictability feels safe. When you feel responsible for everyone, there is always something to do, someone to help, something to manage, something to monitor, something to anticipate, something to prepare for. The role creates structure. It creates certainty. It creates the illusion of control. And for a nervous system that once experienced emotional unpredictability, that can feel incredibly reassuring. Consider a daughter who grew up never knowing what version of someone she would encounter. A good mood, a bad mood, withdrawal, criticism, disappointment, tension. The environment felt unpredictable, and unpredictability creates vigilance. The nervous system learns to stay prepared, to stay alert, to stay aware. But eventually, awareness alone isn't enough. The daughter begins trying to influence outcomes, trying to prevent problems, trying to reduce tension, trying to keep things stable. Because stability feels safer than uncertainty. And responsibility becomes the strategy. If I help enough, maybe things will stay calm. If I manage enough, maybe problems won't happen. If I carry enough, maybe disappointment can be avoided. The responsibility creates a sense of certainty, a sense that something is being done, a sense that the situation is under control, whether it actually is or not. And this is why many women feel uneasy when they stop carrying. Because responsibility provided a job, a role, a purpose, a way to respond to uncertainty. Without it, there is space, and space often feels unfamiliar. The daughter can no longer rely on responsibility to create certainty. She has to learn something different. She has to learn that uncertainty can exist without becoming her responsibility, that other people's emotions can exist without becoming her job, that disappointment can exist without becoming her burden, that life can remain safe even when she is not managing every outcome. And for many daughters, this is where healing becomes less about control and more about trust. Trusting that not everything needs managing. Trusting that not everything needs fixing. Trusting that not everything belongs to you. Because responsibility may create predictability. But predictability is not the same thing as peace. And learning that difference changes everything. Section 4. What regulation actually looks like. When many daughters first hear the word regulation, they imagine calm. They imagine feeling peaceful, confident, grounded, certain, unaffected by other people's emotions, unaffected by guilt, unaffected by discomfort. But regulation is rarely what people think it is, because regulation is not the absence of discomfort. Regulation is the ability to remain present while discomfort exists. And that distinction matters. Because many women spend years trying to eliminate uncomfortable feelings, trying to eliminate guilt, trying to eliminate anxiety, trying to eliminate uncertainty, trying to eliminate responsibility. But the nervous system doesn't heal because discomfort disappears. The nervous system heals because it learns discomfort can exist without becoming dangerous. Consider what often happens when a daughter begins changing these patterns. Someone is upset. She notices. The familiar urge appears, the urge to help, the urge to fix, the urge to step in, the urge to take responsibility. For years, the next step would have been automatic. She would act, she would manage, she would carry, and the discomfort would reduce. But now something different happens. She pauses. The urge remains. The discomfort remains. The guilt remains. And for a moment, nothing is solved. Nothing is fixed. Nothing is carried. This is where many women assume they are failing, because the uncomfortable feeling is still there. But this moment is often regulation in action. not because the discomfort disappeared, because she stayed present without immediately escaping it. That is a very different experience, and it is often a new experience. For years, the nervous system learned discomfort to action to relief. Now it is learning discomfort to presence to safety. The lesson changes, the experience changes, and eventually the nervous system begins learning something it never knew before. I can feel uncomfortable and still be safe. I can feel guilty and still be safe. I can feel uncertain and still be safe. I can watch someone struggle and still be safe. I can allow disappointment and still be safe. This is why regulation often looks far less dramatic than people expect. Sometimes regulation looks like not sending the message, not stepping in, not rescuing, not over-explaining, not taking responsibility for someone else's reaction, not abandoning yourself to keep someone else comfortable. These moments may seem small, but they represent an entirely different relationship with yourself. A relationship built on trust instead of responsibility. A relationship built on safety instead of control. A relationship built on presence instead of performance. And perhaps most importantly, a relationship built on choice, because that is what survival patterns often take away. Choice. The pattern becomes automatic, the response becomes automatic, the role becomes automatic. But regulation slowly creates space between the feeling and the response. Space to pause, space to notice, space to choose. And in that space, something important becomes possible. You begin responding from who you are, instead of what survival taught you to do. That process is rarely fast. It is rarely comfortable. And it is rarely linear. But it is how change begins. Not through perfection, not through getting rid of every uncomfortable feeling, but through repeatedly discovering that safety can exist without carrying everyone else, because responsibility may have become your strategy, but it was never meant to become your identity. And as the nervous system begins learning that lesson, another question naturally appears. If I am no longer defined by responsibility, who am I? And that is the question we will explore in the next episode. Because eventually the journey is no longer about understanding the role or understanding the nervous system. Eventually, the journey becomes identity. Who are you when everyone stops needing you? And who are you when survival is no longer leading the way? That is where reconstruction begins. If this episode resonated with you, remember this. Awareness is important. Understanding is important. But your nervous system learns through experience. And for many daughters, responsibility became more than a behavior. It became a source of safety, which is why letting go can feel uncomfortable long after you understand the pattern. If this episode resonated with you, subscribe to the channel and continue with the Emotional Responsibility series. Because eventually, the question is no longer, why do I feel responsible? It's, who am I when responsibility is no longer leading the way? And that's where reconstruction begins.